Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. I've looked at quite a few companies that publish games on the Atari 2600. Well, many of them were shut down either in 1983 or 1984 following the North American video game crash. Some of them were able to keep going. A few of these companies left the video game market entirely, but kept up with their other business ventures. That brings us to Parker Brothers. They were a game publisher for the Atari 2600. As far as I can tell, they didn't have an internal development team, so they basically just took licenses for arcade games and farmed them out to other companies to make for them. So, yeah, they published a lot of stuff from a bunch of different companies. They got licensed products from Nintendo, from Konami, and from Universal as well. I'll always remember this company for their board games, specifically Clue, also known as Cluedo. And yeah, I never really thought of them as a video game developer or a publisher. It wouldn't be until much later when I started playing some of their board game adaptations for the Sega Genesis, which have been pretty awesome, but that's going to be a story for another time. Right now, let's go into a brief history of Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers has been around for a very long time. It was founded back in 1883 and was later purchased by Hasbro in 1991. It would be merged with Milton Bradley and eventually turned into Hasbro Gaming. But before that, Parker Brothers published a lot of very popular board games over the years. Some of them would eventually become video games like Clue, Risk, and Monopoly. They also had board games such as Scrabble, Sorry, and a bunch of weird ones that I just never thought of. They published a lot of board games over the years. In the company's early years, their board games were based on real life events. It was able to withstand the Great Depression, which caused many entertainment companies to close down. It was around that time that Parker Brothers released Monopoly, a game which caused many fights on family game nights when, I was a kid and also when I was playing it in college and wanted to annoy one of the business majors I was, friends with. Parker Brothers would also get into puzzles, and they made puzzles from the late 1880s up until the late 1970s. Never thought about who manufactured puzzles when I was a kid. I mostly just remember a few of Parker Brothers' board games. It's kind of fun when you do a deep dive on a company like this and you just find weird stuff that they made that you never would have thought of. But Parker Brothers entered the video game market in the late 70s, like many other toy companies and entertainment companies. They briefly entered the toy market with Rom the Space Knight, which was a relatively limited action figure, but it was still pretty cool for the time, even if there wasn't a whole lot you could do with it. That brings us to their video games, and I specifically want to look at their Atari games right now because, well, that's kind of where I am in the history of video games. Parker Brothers published video games from 1977 to 1996. This period of their history is a little confusing as the company merged with and was bought by various companies throughout the 1980s and 90s before finally being absorbed by Hasbro. I won't be talking about all of that because it's going to get way too confusing, and I just want to talk about their Atari games. The Parker Brothers library is fascinating. It is what you should expect from a publisher in the early 80s. It consists mainly of licensed properties from arcade games, as well as a bunch of stuff that was licensed from pop culture, and you really need to use your imagination to connect the two at times. The games that Parker Brothers published are Amadar, Frogger, Frogger 2, G.I. Joe Cobra Strike, Jiris, James Bond 007, Montezuma's Revenge, Mr. Dew's Castle, Popeye, Cubert, Cubert's Cubes, Reactor, Sky Skipper, Spider Man. Star Wars The Arcade Games, Star Wars The Jedi Arena, Star Wars The Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, Super Cobra, and Tutankhamun. Why they didn't call it Tutankhamun, I don't know. That doesn't. I don't know. That it's a weird game. I don't like it. Let's move on to something else. Parker Brothers did work with a bunch of companies. I mentioned Nintendo and Konami, but they also worked with Universal and Williams as well. So it was a nice way to get games that maybe the arcade developers didn't have time to port onto the Atari 2600. I still haven't really found if they had an internal development team at Parker Brothers, but I'm just guessing that they really didn't and used a bunch of third parties to make all their games. It would be interesting to go back and look at some of that stuff, but I did not have time to do it for this video. I looked up some of the reviews for these games. Atari Compendium has compiled many of the reviews for the different Atari games, even though they're missing a few, which I can kind of understand. The Parker Brothers games received a lot of press, which makes a lot of sense because they were a bigger publisher. They published a lot more games than other companies did. So, yeah, people were really looking at them. And it's great to see what people thought about them at the time, even if the reviewers aren't always a good reflection of what the market was. Parker Brothers games received pretty good scores at the time. Frogger received the highest scores that I could find, while Star Wars games got the lowest, which was kind of surprising for me, but I'm guessing they were a little bit more critical from what I remember. However, Spider Man, Sky Skipper, and Tutankhamun were very close to the Star Wars games. Some of these were ranked a lot higher based on how close they were to the arcade game, while others were pretty heavily criticized for kind of being boring and terrible. I have no idea what they were talking about with Sky Skippers. I thought that was a pretty fun game, but whatever. I'm not going to get into a slap fight with a reviewer from 1983. When I looked back at the review scores, while I was able to find kind of like a top three and a bottom three for their games, the overall just weirdness of these reviews was rather strange. They were all over the place, and yeah, there were also reviews with just no scores as far as I could tell. So, yeah, well, a few of them had like a 2 out of 5 joysticks or a letter grade assigned to it, like A, B, C, or D. Yeah, it made finding a consensus on the entire library very hard. The original concepts seemed to fare very poorly, especially if they tried to do something outside of the norm for the time. The ports of arcade games tended to be received more positively, depending on how close they came to replicating the arcade game. A few of the games that Parker Brothers was working on, or at least had planned, were never released. There were games based on McDonald's, The Lord of the Rings, and The Incredible Hulk. There were also a few other Star Wars games that were planned, but they were just never released for whatever reason. I'm guessing the video game crash just killed the market for them, so they were never put out. Parker Brothers does have a really interesting catalog of games. Well, some of them have been relatively maligned in retrospective reviews. Parker Brothers didn't really publish anything that I thought was absolutely terrible. They published some stuff I didn't like, but everything was playable and it worked well. At least probably it worked well back then. Now it was kind of frustrating to get some of these games to work, but that's just chalked up to age. Spider Man and Q*bert aren't really all that great. This is probably my least favorite port of Q*bert because of its, control scheme. And this game always kind of struggled when they were bringing it from the arcade to the home console just because of how you had to really turn the controller to make it work right. For the Atari 2600, Parker Brothers was a publisher from 1982 to 1984. They also publish games for other systems as well. After a brief pause, Parker Brothers was brought back by Kenner, whom Tonka had bought. This brought Parker Brothers back into the video game industry as Tonka was the US distributor for the Sega Master System. Once that agreement ended, Parker Brothers briefly left the video game business again until being absorbed by Hasbro and brought back in another form, another weird and strange form. Even though Parker Brothers had been bought multiple times, they never really left the video game industry. It's kind of weird to say that, but at least their games never left. You can find copies of Monopoly, Clue, and also Life in a bunch of different forms, and Risk as well. So they still had a presence, even if they weren't the ones behind those games, or they were no longer the publisher of those games. It is a really interesting story, but one that I'll probably get into much later on. Parker Brothers has a long and fascinating history as a company. It had a relatively brief involvement with video games, but the early years were very interesting. In some ways, they were similar to both Sega and CBS Electronics in the early 80s. All of those companies acted as publishers for other companies' arcade games. While Sega could make their own arcade games, Parker Brothers and CBS Electronics had to kind of just fight for not really the upper tier games, but kind of that middle tier of arcade games. So they got stuff like Popeye, but then they were also able to get things like Frogger and Qbert, sort of the more popular arcade games, but ones that weren't gobbled up by like Atari or Coleco or Intellivision. On top of publishing arcade ports, Parker Brothers was able to publish some original games. They weren't always received that well, but I'm sure if I look at other games out there that were not based on arcade games, they probably weren't reviewed all that great either. With the 21 games released, Parker Brothers was one of the more prolific publishers on the Atari 2600. They really didn't have like a terrible game. The worst one that they had was really just averagely reviewed. It isn't a bad thing to have stuff like that, so they didn't have anything as terrible as like games by Apollo, Data Age, or even US games, which is a pretty good thing for a company like this. Anyway, that's where we're going to leave it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.